Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are just waiting on a couple of our panelists to just get into the call here. So if you can give us 1 minute, we should be able to get them online pretty quickly. Just bear with us for 2 minutes here. Thanks. All right, everyone. Hey, thanks for joining us. We still having a little bit of technical difficulty getting some of the panelists into Zoom for some reason. But just to give everyone a little bit of a background here, we've got welcome to those of you. I see we've got some people in the chat thread here as well. But if you have any questions or anything like that, please do feel free to post them in the comments, in the chat, etc. We'd love to make this an interactive discussion. And so while we are pulling in, just waiting on these technical issues here, why don't I introduce our first panelist, Denisse Rudich. Denisse, why don't you give yourself a little bit of an introduction while we wait for a few more people to join?
Sure. Hi, Matt. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
I could put on my video, but it says that the host has stopped it, so I will just speak unless you guys let me go on video.
Yeah,
so with regards, fantastic. With regards to my background, I am a strategic advisor in financial crime prevention. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this session today. I have worked in financial crime prevention for over 15 years as head of policy for Royal Bank of Scotland for AML and sanctions, as a strategic advisor to the regional head of compliance for Rabobank, and I've had my own firm for, I guess, going on to 5-6 years now. I'm doing advisory services with regtechs, fintechs, crypto startups, and I also work in a non-for-profit called The Century, looking at corruption and war conflict in Africa. So very diverse background. I guess in terms of most kind of recently, I set up the first anti-money laundering working group for the cryptocurrency industry. And I've also took part as a technical expert in the fast messaging standards working group, the joint working group for that, which recently issued its common data standards. So AML is my life. It's just counter-terrorist financing and all that wonderful stuff. And I really enjoy working in this field. Thank you.
Awesome. And I see we have Matt McGuire was able to get into the room as well now. Matt, welcome. We're just starting off with a little bit of introductions for the audience on who you are and what area you focus on.
Hey, fantastic. Really super excited to be here. I'm the practice leader at the AML shop. We do AML. And as a consequence, we get involved often in KYC, and we love it. There it is. We deal with everybody from banks to governments to securities dealers to fintechs, and we've even been approached by some money launderers, which is very flattering. I mean, if you have both sides asking for work, you must be doing something right.
Definitely. Wonderful. And I know we have two other panelists that Andrew's still trying to sort out some of their Zoom complications on their side, but we will we'll get that figured out. In the meantime, one of the real point of this discussion today is to talk about digital onboarding and how that can really transform a business, especially in the financial services space, and what what that means as an opportunity, and maybe some of the challenges and best practices. So I guess just by way of a quick introduction, my name is Matthew Unger. I'm the CEO and founder of iComply. Our focus as a company is to really provide a toolkit for things like digital onboarding, KYC, AML, for people in the market who need to identify who the individuals or corporations that they are serving need to maintain compliance. So we do a lot more than just the onboarding, but focus on kind of the full life cycle of the client, including the onboarding piece. But for purposes of today's discussion, I think from a digital onboarding perspective, I remember in 2007 when I was a broker in Canada, we actually built our first onboarding form. It didn't do any onboarding into a platform, but it was basically a lead gen form, which was quite state of the art at the time in Canadian financial services. And it's amazing when somebody brought that up to me recently to compare basically a lead capture form that every website has now to the very sophisticated facial recognition and document authentication systems that are out there. So I'd be curious for the panelists, what do you see as, what is digital onboarding and maybe what is it not? Maybe in just kind of defining the topic a little bit, where does digital onboarding start and stop maybe?
Happy to take a stab at this. So the way that I see digital onboarding is, I guess there's two ways of looking at it. It's either whether you build an in-house solution or whether you get an external service provider to either help you automate or digitize your onboarding solution, or kind of what you guys have done, which is more around kind of building innovation around the anti-money laundering, know your customer due diligence workflow. And again, it can be, it's definitely something that's been coming up recently. What's really great about digital onboarding is just, I was reading a study actually that was carried out a couple of years ago by, I believe, another company. It was 2015, and they found out that traditional onboarding and manual onboarding can take up to 34 weeks and cost up to $25,000 per client, which is insane. It's an insane amount of money. And I think the average cost for onboarding a new client was about $6,000. The client was contacted about 10 times on average to request information, and they were asked to submit either between 5 to 100 documents. So again, whether that was directly or indirectly through via third-party providers, etc. So whenever I think of digital onboarding, I think of it more as it's a combination of automation, a combination of innovation, and a way of streamlining and making the onboarding process and really the anti-money laundering process, because onboarding and all the information that you gather at the onboarding phase is really at the heart of what you see, a little bit more efficient. And if you think about how much money is spent on a global basis, looking, fighting financial crime, I've got a statistic here in front of me. It's 3.1% of global turnover, so around 1.28 billion, which again, those numbers are just, I consider them to be sad numbers, very big numbers that are bigger than they should be. So, so that's what I think of whenever I think of as digital onboarding. But I'll let Matt share some thoughts as well.
Sure, it would fantastic. Thanks for bringing me into that question. Listen, we're talking about the challenge we're fundamentally trying to deal with here is begins with anyhow the beginning of digital delivery. The point is that we have to deal with people in an online space. We have to figure out who they are in an online friendly way. And so increasingly, the amount of situations where we have to do that, not just because of technological advancement, but because of things like COVID, the demand is escalating quickly. And so then we have the second problem, which is that if my identity is going to be represented digitally, if there's some form of ways that I can show that a trusted party has identified me, if I can prove that who I am biometrically or through my devices or through different factors, why not do that? Why not have a more streamlined way? Particularly, the next question that arises logically is if there can be a concept of digital ID, why aren't I giving the user, that person, control over his identification? Who they are is largely determined by who they're determined to be and what they do, and so all that information about that person is sensitive and is being derived from some sort of intimate interaction with somebody else, and so I guess digital ID is a method not just to identify somebody digitally, but it can be a way for somebody to control what's known about them and how they start to participate with others in a system.
Mm-hmm. So when we're dealing with like onboarding an individual, going back to that concept of web forms and private, passwords, etc. Why, when I open up a bank account at or I need to do a transaction with a broker, I don't take a photo of my identity documents and give it to them. I don't do any of this stuff. Why do you have to do this in an online environment? I'm saying I don't in a face-to-face meeting, basically.
Yeah, and you first.
You're so polite. You can go. I'll let you. We'll be very Canadian about this. I'll let you go first, and then I'll jump off of that. Thank you.
No, you first. No, but I was just going to say, I remember when I was first having discussions about identity and its importance early on in AML, and all the discussions then were that who you are is what you are, right? There was such a focus on biometrics. Which has really come out of fashion in a whole bunch of ways, and for some really good reasons. It's far better that a trusted network are the ones that are willing to put their stamp on who you are, and that even in some cases your social network will put a stamp on who you are as a means to figure that out. The problem with the old focus on biometrics was that once your biometric is burned, it's done forever. You're not getting a new fingerprint. You're not getting a new retina, and so that's largely come out of favor.
Yeah, and that issue of the right to be forgotten when you think of personal information becomes problematic when a digital identity, which is different than digital onboarding, but when a digital identity is based, if your face is your private key, if your face is your password, as an example, you can create some unique scenarios. I saw a movie, or maybe it was even a Netflix series where somebody was able, needed to get into this person's bank account, and it had a thumbprint scan on your phone, and so they just chopped the guy's thumb off and put it on his phone, and they had their biometric authentication. So I think there's a really important thing when we think about biometrics that, when I think of facial recognition as an example, we've always thought of, your face is your public key. It's how it works in the real world. I see photo of Matt here and I recognize him, but that doesn't mean I have, knowledge of his personal passwords, etc. And his face shouldn't be used as access into a system. It's just too easy to access into somebody's face, or even things like fingerprints in today's world. Mariela, I see you've joined us. Could you just maybe start with we were just having a little chat around some of the pieces on digital onboarding, but maybe you could introduce yourself and your background.
Hi, sure. Yeah, thank you for having me. So my name is Mariela Tanchez, and I'm the Marketing and Commercial Director for Bitfoliex, which we are an online crypto wallet, soon to be exchange. And we have definitely just started integrating KYC into our platform. And so definitely we've run through all the issues, whether it's, I've been in both sides, whether it's from the customer side and also like from the business side, which kind of complicates things. So I think that has given me a lot of new insights that you would never think when you're digitally onboarding this kind of solution to your product. So thank you for having me, and hello to everyone.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think Andrew's going to be able to join us back in a minute here. But maybe one of the things, from the perspective of digital onboarding, and we think of what is digital onboarding, as a workflow, what are kind of the key components that people should be considering? Is it just capturing the name and information, and are there I guess when I'm looking at it as one example is, capturing the user's name, or their full legal name as an example, or capturing things like biometrics. I guess, are these things, what are the steps in a typical digital onboarding workflow, and how do you guys normally think of these different chunks of the workflow when you're either designing or implementing your own digital onboarding systems?
I think that one of the first steps is definitely communicating well with your provider. We had this issue when we first started onboarding. We had another provider, and at the beginning, I wasn't involved. The people that were truly involved in the process weren't having that direct communication, and that came up with a lot of problems because, for example, we thought the product wasn't managing, for example, we have customers in Asia and China, and all the verifications were coming back, and we were like, okay, there's an error here, our provider's not working. And it ended up being that we simply hadn't negotiated the OCR for a different alphabet. And so I think the first thing is definitely have a good communication with your provider to see exactly what you need, and making sure to, because as a customer, you really don't know what you need until you kind of go with it, but try to think of every single issue that could happen. If your customer is from another country, if your customer, for example, is residing in one country but has an ID from another country, what would happen then? Try to create all this scenario so you can have the best digital onboarding, and definitely have good communication with your provider. Another thing is definitely take into consideration what's it going to take to integrate with your platform, because at the end, when you're looking for digital onboarding, you're looking for automation in every single way. Like, you want to reduce the kind of people that will actually touch people's documents and will have access to this information. So if the system can do it all, that's perfect, and that's, I think, the goal for every single one of us. But you need to make sure that it's going to work with your systems, and how you're going to integrate the information with your KYC provider, with your systems, so that it's safe, secure, but at the same time, it's not invasive to your customer. And so I think I'm going to go back a little bit on the steps. I think step number one is figuring out what you need to comply with, figure out the laws you need to, that are regulating you, whether it's on your customer side, if it's, if your customers are European, you have to comply with that, or on your business side, wherever you have your base. So definitely check which laws and regulations you have. Then based on that, talk with your provider, see the integration, and see what steps do you need to take. And then also, I think a very good point is also kind of knowing your customer to see how you'll integrate his information, because not everyone wants to give you all their information, especially digitally. Not a lot of people are necessarily ready to be able to provide pictures and all their information to a computer. And so make sure you also like generate that consciousness of people that you're going to keep their information safe, and also take into account all the safety procedures that you need to take to keep them safe. And then I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that's the right place to start. I mean, we have to, I mean, I like starting these stories from the privacy lens to begin with, right? Which is, what is your use case? Like, what are you using this for? And because, you know, it's so funny, a fellow in India had me on his webinar, and when he sent out his registration, he asked everybody for age. And, you know, a few people wrote, why would you need to know that? I don't need to know that. For, you know, our AML webinars are generally G-rated. You know, so after use case, the next, you know, the next question, you know, becomes, what are the risks, right? And so if my use case is for securities, then it's not just, I don't just need name, I need a few things confirmed, right? I need name, address, I do need to know date of birth for you know, capacity purposes, and I need to know a little bit about suitability. And so that comes back to the idea of risk. So whether the risk is from a suitability perspective, what do I really need to know? Do I really need to know he's an accredited investor or not? Do I have some indicators that make me need to prove it? You know, and then as we get down that road, we say, well, what are the financial crime risks here, right? And that's the lens I'm usually looking at things through, which is to say, you know, how certain do I need to be of this person's identity? You know, and so you consider all sorts of factors around that, right? If it's a group insurance policy, the answer is probably, you know, lower than if the identity is about the person's capacity to be able to make third-party payments.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm gonna jump in here as well in terms of how do you develop, how do you even begin developing your digital onboarding? I think what Mariela said was fantastic. You know, identify your requirements and define design your onboarding platform. You know, you have to identify your customer. You have to screen them for sanctions. You have to identify any adverse press to protect yourself. You have to risk assess them, you know, and that looking at country. And if you have new technology, there's a very traditional way of risk assessing your country that takes into account, you know, industry, country, delivery channel, which is again face-to-face versus non-face-to-face. We're now at non-face-to-face in the world of non-face-to-face. Entity type or customer type, and I'm missing one. Matt or Mariela, jump in here if you can think of it. But there's also, you also then have to verify the customer, and then you also have to keep all of those records for an ongoing for the rest of the customer life cycle. And then you have to start thinking about, okay, so how are you actually going to identify your customer? Are you going to identify your customer by having them put in their information, all of their information, or partially put in their information, link up to a natural language processing platform that then augments that information? When you're going to be doing sanctions and adverse press screening, are you going to be using, again, are you going to be going into OFAC and manually typing in the names? Or are you going to be using a data service provider? And whether you're going to be using the global, you know, kind of monster companies that have been incumbents in this space, or are you going to be using a new emerging tech company that's using AI and machine learning? And then with your risk assessment, generally there are very few companies that actually allow you that actually offer that for you, because it's a very cumbersome process, and you also have to define what your risk ratings are, and there's mathematical formulas that go into this, so you have to generally get somebody who's very good at maths involved and explain it also to your CEOs and your directors, and then you have to think about the verification. So again, are you going to be, we've talked about taking a picture of somebody's ID, and to verify their age in a webinar, like Matt just kind of alluded to, or are you going to be using, you know, a combination of selfie matching and a data service provider that actually talks about or allows you to take the data from a passport chip and validate validate the information or validate the format in which the data has been added onto the passport. So this is, so these are just kinds of, you know, when you're designing your onboarding, your digital onboarding process, you have to think, and also, are you going to be having individuals asking questions of your customers, contacting your customer to try to get them to submit 5 to 100 documents, or are you going to have bots that are going to be gathering that information and feeding that straight into your workflow? And of course, every part of your workflow most likely requires a different service provider to be able to support you with that, with kind of one solution. So you need, you know, a workflow management tool, and also to understand, again, I think the most important thing is where are your records being kept. And once you've defined what you want to do and who you're going to use, then you need to think about your vendor management and how you manage your provider, which was alluded to earlier as well, and having those conversations. So Mariela mentioned about the provider, and we can get into how do you actually manage your risks, your and your outsourcing risks, because that's what you're doing. You are effectively, unless you're building all of this in-house, you are entering into some serious outsourcing arrangements that have serious liability issues for you as an entity building your digital onboarding solution.
Yeah, and I think one very important aspect that we also notice, and I've talked to a lot of people, and sometimes we forget, is document every single step. Because the moment you get an audit, if you haven't been documenting everything, it's gonna get really complicated. And auditors, they really like to ask questions. However, if you document every single step and you really know your vendor, understand how your vendor keeps the information, moves the information, how they work, ask them this information, and make sure you keep a record of all of that. Because if an audit comes to you and you have all that written down, all that process that it took you, it's way easier if you started from the beginning, once you start your digital onboarding, than having to go back and try to remember, okay, what we did here, how we managed information here. And also, you know, like you said, make sure you know where the information is being kept and how it's being kept. That is one of the main things that I've seen in audits that might, you know, become a problem. So I think that's also a very important thing that sometimes we forget, because we are complying, but at the end of the day, we comply for regulators, and regulators eventually are going to audit you. And so to be prepared for those audits, make sure that it goes smoothly as possible. I always recommend keep the documentation of everything you're doing from the start, how you choose your vendor, why you choose your vendor, how your vendor works, how are you keeping information, which people have access to the information, you know, all those details that might come to you. So when the audit comes in, you already have them and you just give them out. And if they see that you have all that already thought of and written, they're going to be way easier on you than if you're trying to struggle to get all this information that they're asking for.
Yeah, and it's actually super interesting, you know, this whole idea of you know, record keeping and stuff along these lines is kind of building for the end use case. When you're building a digital onboarding system for your business, it's a significant amount of technology and resource investment. And I think a lot of people end up, what we've seen, especially in the early stage startups, is they have an idea of their day-to-day operations of how compliance will be done and how much is manual versus how much they're using different services like natural language processing, as Denisse mentioned, or different types of document authentication tools, things like this that help to just speed up and reduce the time and cost per user. But sometimes when people build these systems, they forget that it's not your objective isn't to get the client through. Your end objective isn't just to get the client through and into your platform. It's actually to have all that documentation and be able to easily report on it and know that the record keeping itself, where is it being stored? How is it being stored? Is it encrypted? How much information do you actually need to keep? There's a lot of very exciting technology using things like hashes, using things like cryptographic hashes, using tools like zero knowledge proof that are just starting to make their way into the AML space. And I think we're seeing we're seeing a lot more, but there's always a question of if you're masking information or masking data, will you need to report and actually, will you need to actually produce a report that shows that unmasked information to a regulator? I see we have a couple questions here, so I want to jump over to answer a few of them. The first one is actually in regards to the US, the stimulus checks in the US and the money being paid out, and essentially the amount of fraud that people are seeing. And by integrating a digital solution, how do you see it challenging the traditional models to identify and reduce the fraud that is currently in existence? So maybe open that up to the floor.
I've noted, well, I know there's not a lot of solutions that have this, but we have made our due research, and there is a thing now called the digital identity, which we believe it has come to us to be very, very useful. Why? Because user, you can actually connect which other devices they uses. It's kind of a communication between other platforms of KYC and AML. So you can have better register if this person has been actually involved in any other scams, if it's using a cell phone that it was reported it's stolen, things like that. There's some providers that will provide that. We are actually trying to onboard something like that. So I think with the right technology, it will definitely go down, because you'll be able to actually know the person, and not only the person itself, but the links that this person has with any other issue that might come up. So I think if you take that into consideration and you try to also integrate transaction monitoring, normally when there are scams, they tend to have a pattern. And so just make sure that you understand these patterns, and that you talk with your vendor and make sure that you have some sort of flags or some sort of alerts so that you can be on top of that. And I think with that, the numbers of frauds and scams are definitely going to go down. And because you have the person's information, then you'll be able to actually give them to the right authorities if it came to be a necessity like that. So I definitely think that digital onboarding can definitely help in the US and all over the world, to be honest, with this kind of thing.
So this is quite a specific, this is quite a specific kind of fraud type. And I mean, in my head, I'm like, the fact that they're, using checks to deposit them into their bank accounts, and at this moment, specifically, and in this day and age, I mean, you're using. It's the most traditional kind of fraud, if that makes sense, and combined with welfare fraud, and so it depends on whether it's the government itself has been defrauded, or whether it is one of your customers that isn't actually eligible for the claim, and this is where if you are a new a new kind of company that has it has the ability to set up your own transaction monitoring system however you want, kind of having that 360 view, but also whereby you link the information that you know about your customer with specifically the anticipated levels of income that they're going to be receiving, versus their location, so where their IP location, where their IP is based and whatnot. Then you can create a kind of a very robust, the idea of a robust transaction monitoring system. By also linking into things like the credit reference agencies that have lists of individuals who have been identified as being fraudsters, or even victims of fraud themselves as well, right? Where their identity has been stolen, you can then try to identify whereby, this type of fraudulent claims are being perpetrated against your customer, or whether it's your customer that's actually perpetrating it against the government. But this is where I think you still need a little bit of human intervention to be able to either teach your machine that this is the criteria to qualify for the stimulus that's being handed out by governments around the world, or actually understanding or having somebody manually go through and say, well, why are they cashing this check if they're actually still receiving an income, or if the company is actually still trading and operating as expected. So these, you can definitely do interrogation of your data and then try to identify kind of what's going on.
Well, this leads to one of the other questions that came in just a moment ago, right? Which is this whole idea of what are the external data sources that we can reference. And so I'm a big supporter and super interested in the concepts of how we can apply open banking to these fraudulent scenarios, right? Where we can say, don't just tell me that your income decreased. Give me permission to the access needed to be able to show that those electronic deposits you pay aren't what they used to be. Those data points make a lot of sense. And when this can start opening up blind spots. I think a lot of the problem of financial inclusivity around the world have to do with this unintended consequences of AML, which is that, if I have a blind spot, a risk I don't understand, my response is to either limit the services or shut down the relationship altogether. If I had access to these greater data sets to be able to understand what the expected activity of the person is based on their historical transaction information on even just a profile of those things, man, I'm sure a lot more people would be willing to offer the services. A lot more folks would have the greater certainty they need in terms of ID based on behavior.
And to add a bit of color to that, of the question that was posed from the audience, is AML toolsets seem to be coming a long way since the days of using raw data sets. And from the perspective of what types of technology would you be considering looking at to stay compliant with these changes, but also using a competitive advantage for the time of my administration team?
I think I know that Denisse mentioned something in regards to this earlier, when you're doing things like, I'm just going to assume that for AML tools, we're really looking at things like risk screening, sanction screening, etc. I know that, in our own journey in enhancing our system, false positives, you have huge amounts of data sets, but if I was unlucky enough to have been born and named Osama bin Laden, getting a bank account would be a horrible experience for me every single time I tried, because immediately, as soon as my name gets entered into any sort of risk management system, it's going to be throwing a lot of flags. And we definitely have seen a lot of digital onboarding tools in the market where they're pass-failed systems. So they see, oh, this person's name is Osama bin Laden, therefore we can deny, we have to deny them service, but it's actually not the right Osama bin Laden. And that's maybe a bit of a egregious example, but the reality is that there's many duplicates of names around the world, and simply doing a name search when you have these potential matches that come back and it says, okay, here's John Smith 1, John Smith 2, John Smith 3. There's a lot of work to remove those John Smiths that aren't your John Smith. So I'd be curious, what do you guys see as best practice in the market to give the efficiency for the AML team to actually maybe remove some of those false positives, or to improve, how can technology be used to take off this? This can often be 8 to 12 hours, I think, is the average per client is spent clicking through potential false positives. What sort of stuff is available in the market? How can technology be used?
There's one technology provider out there called Silent 8. It's one of the coolest ways I've seen to deal with these false positives. And their whole reason for being is to help resolve these potential name match alerts. So they use federated searching to compile the answer, so that this becomes more of a triage function where it pulls together all the open source articles about the person to make inferences about their name, and it essentially presents in summary the details, and the human judgment to be applied is just a few seconds. Like, we provide this sort of service on an outsourced basis, like the resolution of alerts, and it's impossible to keep somebody in that job, right? Like, you go really brain numb very quickly when you have to make these sort of decisions, because there isn't, like, from a judgment perspective, very little is applied, and you know, the work is repetitive and yeah, it just not rewarding.
Yeah, I've likened it when people aren't familiar with what that task is. Imagine if you search for your name on Google and then you just flag every single search that is or is not you. Start there, and then the ones that are you, now you have to see, like, is this, how relevant is this to actually you? And imagine having to do that from a fraud or risk management perspective. Sorry, Denisse, you were
John
doing jump in there.
Smith, the name John Smith is my favorite. The one that brings out everything. So I think that there's a couple of things. I kind of want to go back to that data quality question, because I think it is about data and having quality data. And to be honest, I'm often a lot more concerned about the data that's held in-house by institutions and organizations, even brand new organizations, if they haven't set up the right kind of data governance structures and the right kind of data standards. Even, you know, how do you put in a date of birth, right? Is it 01, 02, 1997? In one jurisdiction, that can be the 1st of February, 19, whatever I said. In the other jurisdiction, it could be the 2nd of January. So just kind of making sure that you have clean quality data in your organization can save you hours and hours of work. So kind of going through a data cleansing process and setting up the right data governance would be the first thing. In terms of kind of data from external providers, I think the one thing I would make sure is that they've validated the data. So some organizations use kind of a minimum 2 external sources. Basically, they have to make sure that the information that has been included, specifically around adverse press, it can be validated by 2 separate sources. And again, that protects you in the long term against kind of liability claims and criminal or civil liability suits against your organization for not providing a solution. In terms of kind of cost reduction, I would like to highlight, for those of you who don't know, the Financial Action Task Force recently issued a guidance on digital identity. And one of the statistics that came out of it was that regulated entities using a digital ID system could see up to 90% cost reduction, with the time taken reduced from days or weeks to minutes with new technology. And I think there's a difference in understanding what is the technology that's available out there and what are the solutions that can be provided. So again, whether it's cloud computing, whether it's real-time analytics, whether it's against zero knowledge proof, which is eventually I understood that, or whether you're using a provider that actually is able to pull together some of these, cloud computing with network analytics, with natural language processing, and with behavioral analytics as well, to provide you a solution that can then, train itself to triage alerts or to be able to reduce, basically say, actually, there's enough adverse press around this individual, they're a politically exposed person, there's adverse press around them, and they live in a less than favorable jurisdiction. So it is the individual that you're onboarding is the right individual, and B, you probably don't want that customer on your books. So really understanding the solution and the technology is key. And what is the technology that they're using, and the exposure that creates for you as either a regulated entity or an authorized entity, or somebody who has to comply with anti-money laundering regulations, or even just to manage your own risks against financial crime. I'm not sure if I answered the question or not.
Yeah, I think that's, the FATF report on digital onboarding had a lot of really interesting pieces there, and the cost reduction is absolutely huge. Firms are spending, there was a stat, I think Denisse mentioned at the beginning, up $25,000. There's one major financial institution that we've been working with for quite some time to bring these costs down. And if you're in the fintech world, when you hear how much, people say, how much does it cost to onboard one client? And they're kind of, they're looking at, a certain price point that's usually well below $10 is kind of their expectation. Sometimes they're looking at only one piece of the workflow or asking one question. But a lot of times people are imagining this is, the cost around this is, it's going to be fully automated end to end. It's going to cover X, Y, Z. And then on the other side, we have firms like this one, which is a major multinational financial institution, and they're spending for their commercial clients on average $30,000 per year on compliance. So there's a huge difference in the definition of what is compliant between different types of players. And I don't think the $30,000 thing is sustainable. I think most institutions are aware that that can't continue. We need to have these efficiencies. Digital onboarding is one, reduction of false positives is another. These are all very, especially things like, people who get into the role of, digital crime, like financial crime fighting or working in the KYC department or in the AML department, they're kind of, most of them didn't get into this because they were super excited about clicking through data, 6,000 data entry line items to see, is this the right person? And that's day one. And then day two, they do it all again. That's, that data entry and that type of very repetitive, very, kind of, your eyes start to peel back as you stare at the screen for too long kind of work. Those are areas I think where there's a lot of opportunity for technology to not just reduce cost, but fatigue from your team. Like Matt mentioned, these people, they can't stay in the role. It's a burnout role. If you're in it for too long, you need to move around just to be able to even be effective. Because, if we go back to that idea of going into Google and seeing 6,000 matches for the name John Smith, by the time you get to match number 900, the likelihood of you clicking the wrong yes or no on that, it just increases. And so if we can reduce that fatigue, we can actually increase our effectiveness as well. So I don't know, Andrew, I think we've got a couple more questions that are coming in as well.
Yeah, and we're kind of flowing right into this next question here, where there are a number of clients and people on this call that are attending today that have compliance requirements, but may not have a compliance department or may not have the compliance staff to deal with what's coming through these digital onboarding portals. And even in some cases, these portals are not directly client facing for the people that they're verifying. There are agents on the front line kind of doing a downstream onboarding of the client on behalf of them. So if I'm going to be outsourcing digital onboarding, which is the question here, a concern of mine is data quality that can considerably increase my cost without any controls from my end. So what are the considerations I need to be making when selecting vendors to own this part of my business?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, we actually went through this, and I think I felt like that when we were trying to choose a provider. And even though we had to move because our first provider wasn't really what we needed, like I said, the first thing is to really communicate what you need from them. But I think the human part, we're not ready to let go, especially because of what we were talking before. You might get false positives and false negatives. You're always going to need someone to be checking those just in case. But if you have a very good solution that can automate most of the process, like we were looking to hire, if we had to hire only people and do it manually, we would have to hire about 50 to 60 people to do the work that we're doing right now with only 8 persons and the program we're using, the vendor we're using. So I really think like cost efficiency for us, it was really good. And I think that digital onboarding is definitely going to help anyone. You're still going to need people to obviously manage the platform and all of that. But if you think of the perspective that either way you have to do it because you have to comply, then I think it's a very cost effective to have a good solution. Just make sure that it applies to your customers, to your needs, to what you need. For example, it can even make sure that if you need the picture to be taken in a good quality, make sure there's they have that at the moment that the client is taking the picture of their document, the system automatically takes that. And kind of those details that make the process easier, and you won't have to be revising manually each one and asking them again. but I really think like it's way better for us. It was way better to have that digital onboarding. If not, we'll have to have a bigger department, and it was a really good experience. We're still managing to get it all together, but definitely worth it.
Well, I think that the first thing that I always say is that you can delegate a function, but you can't delegate the responsibility. So the first aspect of that is, if you're using an outsourced provider, make sure make sure through a proof of concept or some sort of exercise that they're going to do things in the ways that your standards require. And then don't just leave it alone. The next important thing is oversight, right? So that making sure over time that this function is working. There's a global TV article that'll be coming out shortly where, a few financial institutions in Canada ended up missing nearly $10 billion worth of FinTrack reports because they started a system running and didn't check in on it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so without the sort of internal audit, without that oversight, you're just asking for problems. Then finally, it's the training. So people that you put in those sort of functions, are replacing your internal folks. And so things like fraud, things like money laundering, things like sanctions, there might not be the same incentive structures. There's an enhanced risk of not detecting one of those issues when you're using an outsourced provider. And so you have to compensate for that risk.
Yeah, I think there's actually, when we're talking about outsourcing, and specifically the question was around the data quality, the early digital onboarding tools that were in the market, a lot of them started with what was called KBA, knowledge-based authentication, or they would be looking at, matching your credit bureau data, etc. The problem is that, even for myself, I live in British Columbia in Canada. I renewed my driver's license recently. And here in British Columbia, the way that the driver's licensing bureau handles things is when I update my address, they actually give me literally a little sticker. It looks like something you put on a mailing envelope, and it has your new address on it. And you just put that right over top. So all of a sudden, these document authentication systems for anyone who's moved in the last 5 years have an address on them that isn't meeting the document authentication criteria. But not only that the information that they're reading off of the barcode on the document and pulling that information is actually going to still be the old information because they're not updating the barcode. And so now you've pulled an old address, and if they're using that old address and checking it against, let's say, credit information, it's not going to, if I've updated my address with my bank already, etc., it may actually not be the right data. So you might have the right person, but just a bad data set. And we were in Canada, at least, these kind of, using this kind of a method, I think we have about a 65% failure rate with the data sources that are allowed to be used. So when you're dealing with these onboarding procedures in different jurisdictions, and kind of our thinking behind it has been, yes, this is what the regulator says that you can do, but what does that do for the confidence of, you're dealing with the right person? Because sometimes in some jurisdictions, and I'll pick on Canada as one, it's incredibly easy to create fake accounts for people. If I find your driver's license in a wallet on the street, I have everything I need to open an account. If I pull something from your mailbox and that place isn't doing document authentication or any sort of facial recognition, but specifically the document authentication piece, I have enough information just by stealing something from your mailbox to go create accounts on these online services. And there's a major bank in Canada that recently rolled out a digital onboarding tool after COVID. And we went into that app and I think created about 100 fake accounts in only a few minutes, because the system wasn't really looking at this, what happens when the data fails, or when the person has the right data, but it's the wrong person who just has enough knowledge. And so I think when we're looking at the data quality thing, I think we have to kind of go from the perspective that there will be problems with your data. So when you're building your workflow, expect that you can't always trust the data sources. So how do you verify? And if there is a mismatch, how do you remediate?
So Matthew, were these all fictitious IDs, or did you try to make synthetic IDs? What sort of combinations of things did we try out there?
Synthetic worked, fictitious did not in this case. But yeah, so, and maybe you want to kind of go into what's the difference between synthetic and fake IDs maybe.
Yeah, so you could just, you know, so a fake ID, you could just make up a name and a date of birth and criteria about yourself that aren't true, or, you know, a synthetic ID is all the more dangerous and lately prevalent, where somebody transposes numbers in a date of birth, or slight variations on details about a person, so that, you know, it's close enough that the system lets you through. So many, I mean, tragically in Canada, so much of our ID depends on credit bureaus. Credit bureaus don't have perfect data. Credit bureaus have been hacked. And so, you know, it creates the opportunity to create a completely new identity, which is just a derivative of another.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's two major springboards here, because we've talked about one end of the spectrum in Canada where it can be predominantly easy to spoof using that type of combination. Who's just joined our call, though, is Lav Odorovic from Forto CH in Switzerland, where they have very unique requirements for digital onboarding that do help kind of combat this with a different standard for that identification piece around biometrics. So Lav, I'd love for you to introduce yourself at this point, and then I'll run to that next question.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lav. I'm CEO of Cofounder of Forto. We're building a bank in Switzerland using a fintech license, so some sort of light banking license, and targeting small and medium businesses. However, we are targeting those especially who let's say, undeserved, who have a hard time to open bank accounts, but not because they really pose a real compliance risk, but it's because they just do not fit the patterns of that, you know, the banks would expect. And we created an algorithm which is an adaptive online form which takes every customer through a journey of answering questions, with every new question appearing based on the previously given answers, hoping to minimize the number of iterations with a bank, and hoping to semi-automatize, let's say, the decision making in account opening process, but not only in account opening, also down the line with ongoing monitoring, because we would store tremendously more inputs, and not only more, but much deeper insights about our customers that we would later on use to have a better, hopefully better ongoing monitoring as well. So I hope this is good enough for the intro. And would you mind maybe repeating a question once again? I sort of lost.
Yes. So we just covered an example where in Canada, if you have somebody's identity document and perhaps you went on their Facebook, you can start opening up accounts in this person's name as one form of fraud, because there's very little in the Canadian market that's forcing you to do any further identification to prove that the person at that device is the person on that document. But I know in your jurisdiction, Lav, you guys are held to a much higher standard with regards to video KYC. So I would love to know, if it's so easy to spoof Canadian companies, which is the question here from the audience, what is the best practice for preventing fraud while keeping users engaged in an onboarding workflow in somewhere like Switzerland?
So yes, it is a challenge, and this is something that I learned actually from Matthew, is that we could take the approach of having a different onboarding from people coming from different jurisdictions, trying always to follow the higher between the local jurisdiction like our own and the jurisdiction from where our customers are coming. So Switzerland itself, I would not even say it's of course a bit stricter than Canada, but not nearly as strict as Germany, for example. And I also don't think that this additional level of strictness is bringing value. So for example, in Switzerland, in Germany, you would require to speak with a live agent, while in who would then identify and compare whether the person on the photo is really of the ID is the person that you're speaking with. While in Switzerland, it would be enough for software to do the same by asking customers to smile and to move their face to really detect the liveliness. So I'm hoping that this would be a far smaller topic in Switzerland than it is in Canada, but I'm not really sure how could this be tricked actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially from the country by country. You know, use Canada versus the U.S. and even the workflows between Canada and the U.S. Next door in countries that are very synchronized in many ways. Digital onboarding workflows are different. What FinCEN says is okay is different than what FinTrack says is okay. And most people don't realize that when they're purchasing systems. And so, you know, because you referenced Lav, the conversation that we'd had previously, the idea of having a different workflow for different jurisdictions is not just because the regulator says that this is done this way. You can go above and beyond. And in fact, in most cases, I would say, if you, using the Canadian example, if you just do the current standard of what's required, it's quite easy to bypass. So many firms, to make sure that they have integrity in their data and their user bases, are already, you know, they take steps to go above just doing an Equifax check. They may be doing different things like asking the person to provide a document of proof, you know, a utility bill showing their address and having that compared against their you know, their photo ID documents, but then also performing authentication on those ID documents. If you were to give everybody, and this is something that we hear platforms, there's a couple questions here related towards, you know, country by country, taking users on from different jurisdictions. The last thing that you want to do, and I'll give you an example because we do work with people in places like Germany and Austria where the standards are very complex, and the bar is very high, and you have to have a live agent behind the screen, and we're going to do a Zoom or a Skype call and go through, and you're going to hold your phone passport in front of the screen, and I'm going to try to see if there's reflection and look for security features and make notes. Well, just that person's time spent on that for every session, the time to schedule a call with that person and all of that, that starts eating up your cost, and you're back to doing KYC in a very manual, you know, 19 or 2005 way maybe. And so I think, you know, when you look at that, you may realize like, okay, just that one process, that might cost me 15 euro. But if I were to do, use computer vision and run a video session and perform facial recognition, perform the same checks, have those same things being done, and have the computer documenting so it can always be audited in the future, your cost is factors and factors lower. Now, in some jurisdictions, like Germany, you still can't use that, even though it's arguably more secure and more auditable than somebody who took notes off of a video call. The regulator has a very prescribed standard. And so what we've really seen organizations look at is, one, when you're assessing which markets you want to serve, you need to take compliance into your customer acquisition cost and understand that the workflow will be different. And then two, when you're onboarding, you want to look for how do we have integrity in our authentication process, and make sure that we meet the tick boxes, if you will, but you need both of those. And so sometimes you can use technology in one jurisdiction, like what Lav was referring to, like the Swiss method is actually very secure, very scalable. And to date, we haven't been able to really find a way to cheat it. You know, things like deep fakes, it can very easily detect things like video interception, deep fakes, things along those lines. But there is always, with enhanced security and compliance, there is a trade-off. Now the user has to sit there and smile and do all these weird things in front of the camera, and the regulator in Canada doesn't require it. So a firm who's onboarding people from Canada may say, well, I actually don't have that obligation. I don't want to be running a 15-second video at 27 frames per second and managing all of this, you know, and have all of this stuff as part of my workflow. And so I think there's a balance to be made, and it doesn't mean that you have to apply the highest standard everywhere in the world, but looking for what you can, you know, what is the most cost-effective way to get to a high degree of integrity. That's I would say one of the big things that we look at. Just looking at time here, just for the sake of our guests, if you do have to drop off, we are recording, and you know, we'd be happy to continue through these questions. But if anyone does need to drop off, you know, by all means, no hard feelings. Maybe we can jump into, we have a question here for Matt and Denisse. Andrew.
So Matt and Denisse from our audience, this may be applicable to your knowledge in AML, but as you've seen the progression of unstructured data sets and given the scope of what they can cover, do you see situations where it would be more applicable than a structured data set, which at times can be slow at identifying financial risks?
Yes, absolutely. But you've got, again, you have to have the right algorithm to be able to process the volume of data that you need, and I guess an understanding of what it is specifically that you are looking for. So there's a really interesting company here in the UK called Futureflow, and they have used network analytics basically to try to pick up, not to try, they've actually been successful, to pick up suspicious networks of activity and behavior and transactional activity between them. Now the challenge with what they do is that they need open banking, and not just open banking, but open banking data to be able to do that. But they've actually been able to figure out how to work through this in a completely anonymized way. So they're part of the FCA sandbox, or they were part of the FCA sandbox, and they're now part of the Information Commissioner's Office's sandbox here in the UK. And this is the bit about intelligence and data is, again, structured data sets. We know that with transaction monitoring systems, so we're moving a little bit beyond digital onboarding specifically, but when you have rules-based data sets and very fixed data sets, you might miss, it's very easy to miss what's in front of you. Whereby if you have unstructured data sets, sometimes it's like looking in for a needle in a haystack. So you have to have tech that is trained properly, that has been set up properly, that there's security around it as well, to then be able to kind of identify, to be able to find the value and the one kind of, I guess, the golden nugget that's leading you to trail and actually being able to prevent financial crime. So I do think that there's a future of a kind of like an intelligence-led, or a bit more of a future of intelligence-led, data-led financial crime prevention, as opposed to detection, which is kind of where we live at the moment. So we spend a lot of money trying to figure out what's happened in the past, as opposed to, and trying to prevent it. And this is where, again, digital onboarding comes in, because it's the ability of keeping people out of the financial system that necessarily shouldn't be there. And I'm just very quickly going to jump on what Matt was talking about with regards to the onboarding procedure. So I see this question from the crypto perspective. I think the other thing to keep in mind, the beauty of anti-money laundering is that all of the regulations come from the Financial Action Task Force 40 standards. So in principle, you should have similarities across jurisdictions of what people are required to submit to be able to open up an account with a financial institution or an entity that's required to comply with the anti-money laundering standards. I think the difference is if you are operating in one jurisdiction and you have clients coming from all over the world, what you probably want is a solution that caters to that, that's able to identify identities from all over the world, not just necessarily from the UK or from Switzerland or from Canada, if you will. However, if you have operations that span worldwide and you have locations not just in Canada or not just in England or not just in Switzerland, but across all jurisdictions, that's when you need to start looking at customizing for different countries, because you're going to have to comply with the prescriptive guidance that has been issued by each regulator for that particular jurisdiction. However, if you are, again, located in one place and taking on clients from all over the world, it's just having the ability to validate the information and authenticate that the individual that says whoever they say they are is that person. And also, I think this is where geolocation and understanding where the IP address This is also really important to be able to identify whether an individual is opening up an account where they say they're opening an account from, as opposed to saying they're from Ireland, but they're really based in North Korea, for example.
Well, that's a good example. And I think there's actually, this question, one thing I will mention that we see a lot of times from players in things like crypto is, they may get a license in Estonia, and then, they start serving UK residents and Canadian residents, etc. And as we've seen from some of the regulatory enforcements that have been and regulatory warnings that have been coming out over the last year, the regulators tend to have a different perspective that, if you're serving a user in that jurisdiction, you're subject to that regulator. And you may have if you're providing a financial service to someone in that jurisdiction. So it's important to consider the obligations not only extend to the variation of how you onboard the person, but also how you may report and even who you report to.
And if Mariela here has any insights on what Bitfoliex had to endure and go through when they were building out what that looked like for their own architecture, I'd love to hear your insights here, Mariela.
Definitely. Yeah, we mostly had an issue because of the alphabet. So normally with Latin alphabet, like English, Spanish, most European countries, you're good. But when it came to Russia and China, one thing that you do really need to take into account is that some softwares will not take in the actual alphabet. So I think that's a very good point to start with. And then of course you're gonna need to divide. You cannot have a one size fits all. That is definitely not. You can generalize most things, but you also have to take into account that, for example, there are different IDs in different countries. Like in the US, you have the passport and your driver's license, and your driver's license works as a national ID. But then you have other countries like Latin America where you have your passport, your driver license, and your national ID. So you also have to make sure which ones are you only going to take passports? Are you going to take national IDs? Are you going to take different IDs? That's another really good point that came up to us. And also because you don't want to limit your client. If you say, oh yeah, I'm just going to take passports to make my life easier. Yeah, you're making your life easier, but at the same time, are you losing clients because you're not taking other types of IDs? And at the same time, can you verify that the other IDs that they're using, how are you going to verify that they're real? So definitely, I think that's one thing when taking a digital onboarding, making sure that the vendor you're using supports all of these different IDs. That you also have some sort of communication. Like we found a vendor that actually can verify with local authorities for blacklist and sanctions and stuff like that. So I think that's another thing that has really helped us because we don't have to do it manually. The vendor actually does it for us and we just verify, but the verification process manually takes little, and we only do it when there's a red flag with our clients. And then also definitely understanding the different laws of different countries, that's gonna change completely. And mostly like data, making sure how you're storing your data, because for example, we do take customers from the European Union, and so you have to comply with their data information. Make sure that if a customer asks you to delete their data, you have to do it, but at the same time, how do you keep track if they were monitoring transactions and all that? So that's a really good point. You have to really make yourself really knowledgeable about the different regulations, whether it's your base country or whether it's your client's rights and because they're living in another country. So I would definitely say make sure normally vendors will guide you, but you have to tell them. I have clients from here, and they'll normally be able to tell you, okay, you might have to do this, you might have to do this. We found that actually the vendors have been great help for us to really like mitigate this process. And sometimes I would also like recommend, if it's necessary, just talk to a local lawyer from wherever your jurisdictions are, just making sure that he goes over your process real quick and tell you, okay, you're good, or you might need something else. That also helped us to make sure that we're complying in every single way, because it gets complicated when you have to comply with your own laws from your jurisdictions, but then you also have to comply with the laws of your customers' jurisdictions. You also have to be careful with the IP addresses. Are you taking clients from countries that your business might be illegal, like China. China has a lot of restrictions. So just making sure that you're not going to get into trouble just because you didn't verify all these little things. So I would definitely say the more knowledge you have about all the regulations, the better.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You mentioned, as an example, language support, and this can be a problem that we've seen people run into as well, where they simply don't know the language of the company or the country that they're serving, and
but I think there's I think one thing that I'd be very curious, Mariela, I know you guys started out with a bit of a I think you've been around for a couple of years now, and I'm sure when you onboarding workflow and kind of the how you did things compared to now well over 1 million users, what are the key areas that you've seen change as you've had to scale your compliance operations?
Definitely having a good vendor. That's I think the #1 rule. Having a good vendor, someone who's not only has a good product that adapts to your needs, that automate most of your processes, but also that will help guide you throughout the whole process, because it can become very hectic and you don't know what you're doing at the beginning. So definitely have a good vendor. And then also having a good compliance team. You definitely need a compliance team. Businesses that say, no, I'm just going to have someone from customer service oversee this or whatever. I understand that you might want to reduce cost, but this can become more costly later on, because if you don't have someone who's fully involved, fully checking everything, like I said, keeping records of everything, if you at any point you get audited, you're going to get extremely high fees and any other impositions from the government that you're going to have to pay. So it's better if you have a good compliance team that are fully involved, that they fully understand the platform and the vendors you're using. One comment they made before is, you have to take responsibility. I completely agree. You have to make sure that even though the platform, it can do everything, you have to set it up in a way that works for you. Because even though if it can do everything, you have to set some rules. Okay, if this person appears on a blacklist, it's going to reject it automatically, or is it going to go to manual revision? If this person's ID is not being really taken as a real ID, I'm going to reject it straight up, or I'm going to have manual revision, because that could also affect your client. If you're asking your client, hey, resubmit your ID, they're not going to like that also. So also take into account all those little things and make sure that you also try the process as a customer. I've seen other businesses which they get all their process and everything, but they never try it out themselves. And so it can be really confusing, especially for a customer. If you have customers that are not really tech savvy, if you don't explain it to them and make it easier for them to make the onboarding easy, and that's only gonna be made when you're integrating, making sure that when you integrate your vendor, if you're gonna use your vendor forms, if you're gonna use your own forms, how to make it easy, how to make it explanatory to people to know that their last name is only gonna be one last name, because there are countries where they use 2 last names. So how are you going to divide that so that people understand that? Kind of those details. Just I think, yeah, one great thing is just try it out yourself, and just don't do it just for the first time. Try it out like once a month. We try to do that in Bitfoliex, just to make sure that everything is running smoothly, and create a lot of tutorials for your customers how to do it, so that they don't get whacked with that. And then on the business side, also be really careful about who you're giving access to, because remember, at the end of the day, it is personal information. It is sensible data. So that's why I say that a compliance team is really important, so you can vet them to make sure they're not stealing your customers' data or using it for any other purposes than what they should be doing, because that could also become a big cost for you. So I would definitely recommend always have a compliance department, even if you just start with one compliance officer, which is also what most regulators will ask you. Most regulators will ask you to have a compliance officer, someone they can communicate with. So definitely start with that.
I'm curious, Lav, you know, your previous business, you know, was also very much in a similar line of work. You guys grew that business massively before you exited and moved on to what you're doing today. But what were the learnings that you had in compliance from the perspective of, you know, being a startup to the point of being a, you know, running business?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Was this a question for me or?
Yes, yeah, it's very similar to you know, with Mariela. Like the as your business grew, what were some of the things that you learned about your compliance operations?
Okay, who shall go first?
Yourself, please.
Okay, happy to. So when we started Penta, we were aiming to solve mostly tech problems for businesses, and we were not even aware that there are so many problems which are, let's say, compliance related. And one thing that Penta did really well, and we were the first one in Germany to properly digitalize bank account offering for businesses. So this went really well. And we started with very few customers, and we were fighting for customers. And today Penta is opening, I think, 5% of all new bank accounts in Germany. So yeah, the challenge.
One thing the audience would love to hear is how you kind of prioritized some of these questions that you posed to the vendors that you chose to support the underlying onboarding tools of Penta. Sorry, Lav, do you want to continue there? Sorry about that. Lav, I think your mic dropped off.
Sorry, do you hear me?
I do now. If you could just start over, I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem at all. No problem at all. So I was just saying that we had to build most of the tools we used ourselves. We had no money. And the only external tool we used was ID Now for ID verification. So the rest of the tools was basically an onboarding flow that we built ourselves. And of course, you know, we at first could onboard very small fraction of customers who were coming to our website, and then we were listening to them and then trying to add more, let's say, edge cases, and then go from being able to onboard 20% of customers who come to our doors to maybe at the moment 85% for Penta. This is an estimate. I'm no longer at Penta, but just a guess at the moment. So yeah, at the beginning, I think, you know, we were probably opening way too many accounts, and then over time we learned to notice many things. And then also we were growing together with Solaris Bank, which was behind us, so we did not have our own banking license. And yeah, what would be the key challenges? I think the key challenges for us would be to widen the number of countries and territories that ID Now supports. Then the next challenge was that ID Now was not really, there were delays. So some customers would have to wait for 45 minutes to get on call. And then on the compliance side, it's not really that we could affect it so much, because the compliance calls were sitting with Solaris Bank and not with us. But we were able over time to persuade Solaris to widen the scope of businesses and industries that we could open. And we, for example, started with just onboarding the existing businesses, and then moved into the foundation businesses too, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure how helpful this is, but
definitely, I think you know, I think that's excellent. I know in my own journey, one of the companies that I started and was a co-founder in 2013. We exited in 2015, and the one thing that we realized there was we built onboarding workflows, and we built programs for it, and bought different vendors, and we built out for one jurisdiction. And then we realized as we were getting acquired that the acquiring jurisdiction had different rules, which significantly devalued even the sale of the company itself. So I think one of the things that we realized is that the promise of fintech is this, serving customers from anywhere, and anywhere that they have an internet connection. But there's definitely, I think one of the best things that a lot of companies can do is actually narrow their scope. What markets do you actually want to serve? Do you want to be subject to the Chinese regulators for one client? But if it's 80% of the clients, people that are coming in to your platform, then maybe there's a big business opportunity in that market. So it's very much a business decision. I see one question here I want to quickly just address regarding IP addresses. It's important to track IP as it's related to detecting citizenship. I'm curious if Matt or Denisse, you have a different opinion, but I would say IP addresses with things like VPNs and different services that you can mask or fake your IP address. I would say it's important to keep it as a point of, or to use it as a point of reference. It doesn't mean that just because a Canadian is close to the US border and happens to be using US cell towers and US IP addresses while they're going through the onboarding, doesn't mean that there's something fraudulent there. But it might be worth you just taking a look at to see, oh, this person's IP address is North Korea. Why is that? So it might be something to warrant looking into further, but I wouldn't use an IP address because this person has logged in from a US IP address, that they must be a US person. There are, with some of the clients that we've worked with in the online gaming space, you'll actually find that online gaming is much more restrictive. The regulations are much more restrictive about location. IP address would never cut it because it's too easy to spoof. Whereas things like location-based services have a much higher degree of certainty that this is actually where the user is. Now, again, I could be on vacation in Bahamas. It doesn't mean that I'm actually, if my GPS coordinates happen to be there. So it can be an important factor, I would say, in looking at the risk of the client, but I wouldn't use it as a if you pop up on this IP address, I'm going to reject you automatically. I don't know, Matt, Denisse, what do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, sorry. May I just second your
please.
opinion very shortly?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's actually counterproductive, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, especially from guys like Denisse who know this really well. But the thing is, if somebody wants to prod you, the easiest thing they can do is VPN, and you can never track it. So it's actually just giving pain to guys who are normal users, and for those who want to fraud, it's just easy to do. I would like to hear opposite opinions as well, but it seems to me that that's not very helpful.
On the VPN, that's amazing. So I think IP address is kind of one factor. The other thing is just kind of, I guess people maybe open up accounts when they're on holiday in the Bahamas, but it's not traditionally, activity, or maybe I'm just very careful. I tend to open it up in my home, or at least the country in which I'm living in. But I have heard of people opening up bank accounts in their car while they're waiting for their children to finish their soccer game and things like that. So, but yeah, Lav, that point that you raised about the VPN, you always raise excellent points about the VPN address is key. And this is again why it shouldn't just be your IP address and geolocation, but it should form kind of a part of a combination of factors that you look at when onboarding. Because, and again, even things like selfie matching, where is the photo being taken? Looking at, why is a photo being taken in a parking lot? Like things like that. Being on the lookout for things that just don't make sense. And that, I guess, thinking about it, that maybe you or kind of 95% of, I guess that goes against 95% of kind of what traditional behavior would look like. But yeah, the thing with criminals, right, is if they're gonna, they're always a little bit ahead of the game because they have the impetus to do this, and quite often they have the motivation as well, and they don't have to deal with governance arrangements and sign-offs and audits and engagement with the regulators and the like. So it's just just trying to stay on top of things as much as possible, and kind of back to the question is whether that's more important than citizenship. I think residence is probably the one area that I tend to generally look at a little bit more closely, where a person is supposed to be physically present and residing versus maybe where they came from. And citizenship might only come into play with regards to sanctions or managing sanctions, where there are comprehensive sanctions in place. But that's where I would go. Thank you.
I would love to jump in with this, just with a real use case that happened to us. I don't believe that you should use it for citizenship itself. Like everyone said, with VPNs, it's really easy to modify that. But it's definitely important to keep it, at least for us, it was important to keep it for fraudulent transactions and scams. What happened with us was that one guy, I don't know where he got a lot of documents, and he was registering a lot of accounts from the same IP. So obviously that threw a flag to us. And when we researched it, apparently all these documents were robbed. And so this helped us determine that this guy was actually a scammer. And if we didn't keep track of the IP, he might have gotten away with it. So that's one use case. The other use case is that, for example, if you're dealing with clients inside the United States, the SEC is really complicated. And if you're allowing people to log in from an IP address from the United States and you don't have the proper licensing, that could get you in trouble. So for example, when we don't have the appropriate licenses in certain geographical jurisdictions, we will block IP addresses coming from that. And even though they're using VPN to access it and they can still access our platform, then the responsibility lies on the customer and not you. So if you ever get in trouble, like, it's not going to be trouble for you, it's going to be trouble from the customer, because you didn't accept the customer from that jurisdiction which you're not licensed in, but the customer was the one doing the wrong thing by using a VPN to access your product. So I would say maybe not for citizenship, but I will always recommend to keep track of the IP because of these two cases and just to protect your business.
Matt, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, the point is, geofencing has to be far more sophisticated than just an IP address, and the risks now around there are more and more risks that have arisen around jurisdictional requirements and who gets to provide services and advertise services to customers at any place. So you got to be super careful about where you're dealing, who you're dealing with, and what fences you put around the services you have.
I think one of the things with the IP address is interesting is, I've seen platforms that have implemented it in the way of this. If you're coming from this address, then it's or from this jurisdiction or from a specific blacklisted address, then you're a no. But if you're if you're coming from another IP address, then it's a yes. And I think that while there are certain things like VPNs themselves, you could blacklist the IP addresses of that VPN service. But just because somebody's choosing to use a VPN doesn't mean that they're actually doing anything illegal. I think more and more, especially players that are dealing with things like cryptocurrency, it's actually prudent to protect things like your IP address, not for not to obfuscate KYC or money laundering, but because the on-chain data sets are all public and available. You want to make sure that your personal information, your financial information, et cetera, is protected. Otherwise, once somebody knows your identity is attached to a specific wallet, they can trace every transaction that you have. So especially as we see more decentralized finance or DeFi movement growing, some of these older methods such as IP address, further to the point that we were talking about before, it's kind of like a flag versus actually being something that would automatically reject a user. And further to Mariela's point, we've seen exactly those types of scenarios where people buy fake IDs, or buy real identities that are stolen, and then use those. And so, that's one possible scenario when you see 100 people onboarding from the same IP address. Okay, well, that could be fraud, but that doesn't mean it is. They could also be that, somebody, you have 100 people all at the same university, and they're all using the university internet, and they're all onboarding from the same IP address. So it should always be maybe an indicator, but it doesn't necessarily mean fraud.
May I just expand on exactly what you said? I think this is, we've seen this a lot, maybe it's not a perfect indicator, but let's use it, better to be safe than sorry. But this will make literally all tech-savvy customers angry, extremely angry. There are a few services that I privately shut down because of using this. There are many people who are using for super legitimate reasons VPNs. And then you try to access the service, and then the service also records your MAC address. And then you turn off the VPN, and then you can't log in just because your MAC address is now blocked. And so I would just say we need also to be thinking not only about, oh yes, this will prevent fraud 1% less, but if this will make life of 90% of customers much worse, and especially with certain demographics, this will make them angry. It makes me really angry when some service is doing this, and I really don't. It makes me feel that this provider of the service don't know what they're doing, and this creates really. And obviously, it's very different, right? So if we talk about the bank account for, middle class US Midwest, and something very traditional or something in a way. Very predictable in their in what they want to see from their bank or financial service provider, then this may actually be a good tactic strategy. But depending on the target market we're serving, this could be extremely negative.
Yeah, I think the VPN. I would agree with your sense of frustration there, Lav, as I've definitely been in these situations where. Your IP address is flagged, or if you're, even as an example, you're using a VPN, you happen to be using a VPN in your browser, and then you continue on for one reason, and you continue on, and now you happen to be, logging in fintech and trying to create an account. You don't even remember that you've, rerouted your IP. So there's definitely, scenarios where I, for myself, have run into problems. And, it's funny, Denisse is saying, I wouldn't, often I wouldn't be at, on vacation in Bahamas. It's a very much an edge case. I totally agree. But at the same time, there may be people who are working abroad. There may be, whose residency is actually still in a different country, but they may be, working in another country. And these tools can be used to flag this, where maybe now you need a proof of address document or, some other form of additional information. But you definitely shouldn't create scenarios where your system is blacklisting users or their addresses, etc. I think there's actually a lot of liability and risk by doing things that way, because, there's many reasons why an IP address could throw a potential false positive. In the interest of time, I want to make sure that we wrap up. Maybe just for the panelists, there was a question here. What if you're looking for a vendor for digital onboarding? So this could be for facial recognition, this could be for identity verification, document authentication, kind of any liveness testing, live video, KYC, any of these types of services. What are the 2 or 3 main first questions that you should be asking the service provider? And I'd love to open this up to everybody here to kind of take a stab at what are those 2 or 3 questions that you should ask right off the top.
Can I take a bat at this one, please? First, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, great. First, I would say, where's your IT security audit? Can you share that with me, please? I would also probably ask, no, not probably, I would also ask them for their hit rate, kind of what's their match rate. And for any actually probably not even just their security audit, just for an audit of their company, if they have one. And if they can provide kind of their sources of data, so their data map or their list of lists, whatever you want to call it. Is there one more thing? I'm thinking about one more thing, but my mind has gone blank. So yeah, IT security audit. Oh, and just a one-pager to explain what their system does, as if they were explaining it to a 2-year-old. Because I would probably then have to turn around to regulator and be able to read that verbatim or explain that verbatim. So again, there is an expectation that you have to understand what it is that your service provider does, specifically if they are using new technology, and that you understand how the technology works. So those are my 3. Thank you. Or 4.
Lav, Matt?
I think Denise brought up good points. I would always look for somebody who knows about the topic much more than I do. And this has so far proven to be so much true. So thank you, Matt, and the others at your great company. So yeah, I think this is the whole idea of why you would buy something and not build it yourself when you're a fintech. And that would be my main criteria.
Well, listen, I think one of the great things to do is to head to DIAC's website, the Digital Identification Council, and they actually have a survey of digital ID providers, and their set of questions of those on that survey is a fantastic basis to think about your provider.
Yeah, that's actually, DIAC is a great organization. I think we're a member of DIAC as well. And yeah, there's a lot of thought that came into that questionnaire from a lot of different organizations. It's diacc.com, I believe, or .ca. But they've done some amazing work in this space, not just around digital identity, but around onboarding, which is really gathering that information for that digital identity. One of the things that I would say is missing in that questionnaire is some questions around data and data processing. You know, the thought process in most traditional financial services, and I've been in that world for almost 20 years now, is, you know, everything was on-prem, on-premise, all your servers, all your data. People are now starting to look at cloud and okay, is cloud computing actually something my institution can do? But one of the things when they think of these systems, a lot of times when people are looking at how is the client's data processed, they're thinking, is the client's data being sent by API? Am I sending this passport to this service? Or is this software being installed on our, you know, on our servers on site? But what's also missing, I think, is a little bit of where is the processing being done, and taking that a step further where you're thinking about your own security and actually think about the privacy and security of your client, the end user. And so there's tools, they call it edge computing or client-side authentication. And that's an area that I know for us has been something that's really helped to increase success rates for people, because you are able to, you know, automatically, while the user's in your session, going through your onboarding process, similar to what Lav was referring to, where you have decision trees. And if you know the answer a certain way to one question, the next question may change somewhat, or what background screening is being done, or if it's a passport, you only maybe have one photo, whereas an ID card, you might have 2, and how you process and extract that information. A lot of that can be done using the computing power of the user's device. So you don't have to take all of this personal information onto your servers. And, you know, we have a demo widget for onboarding on our website. And I enjoy getting notifications to see, we tell people don't submit personal information, try submitting bad information here and see how it responds. And I always enjoy seeing some of the hilarious submissions that people, you know, Mickey Mouse and all sorts of different things. But is your onboarding tool able to, if you think of onboarding in the traditional sense and you walk into a branch, think of what the work that teller or that account manager is doing, they're looking at your face, they're looking at your ID card, they're comparing and saying, okay, this address information is what we're going to put on the account form so that it matches up. And if you change that process and you move that into a digital environment, the branch can actually be the user's device themselves. It can be right, on their mobile, on their laptop, and that first round of screening before it heads back into the compliance department, that first round of screening can be done there. And in a lot of the financial services, depending on what you're doing, there was a question earlier about government subsidies, free money, you're going to have a lot of fraud. If you're offering corporate banking, you're going to probably have a lot higher percentage of people who are actually interested in opening a corporate bank account, and so you may see a lot less fraud in those types of scenarios. But what the nature is of why you're onboarding users could really impact. We saw one company that we were dealing with, a fintech platform where they did their cryptocurrency exchange, and they did a promotion, invite a friend and get $5 or something like this of Bitcoin. And they've been around for several years. They had a fairly massive user base, and they tripled their user base overnight. They literally turned on this campaign and came in the next morning, and they had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of submissions coming through, on an hourly basis. And the submissions was somebody, their level of validation at that time was email addresses. So you create a new email address, and you can, send yourself an invite, you get $5 of Bitcoin and they get $5 of Bitcoin. And so if you structure your system, and if you think about not only is by structuring how the client's data is processed, are you protecting the client's privacy and security in a lot better way, but you're also able to reduce some of these fake submissions. And in their case, using a tool like this would have reduced, out of every 8 submissions, would have reduced 7. And so that, that comes down to just raw cost. If they're paying, $1 per user, that's $8 that they have to pay to get a real user. And so, I think that's one thing that people should really look at as well when they're talking to players is, what is the success rate actually look like? When I submit bad IDs, when I submit good IDs, how does this all come down to the actual average cost of acquiring, not that one user, that one time, not that one price per API call, but what's the cost of landing a real user on average across my business? And if you look at it that way, I think you'll find very quickly that some services will be saving you a lot more money and will be saving you a huge amount of manual review of things like fake submissions or just poor submissions as well. Sometimes users just take blurry photos, as an example. I see we're out of time here. Maybe just to wrap it up, Matt, Denisse, I know Marielle had to jump off a little bit earlier, but Lav as well, thank you so much for joining us. Andrew, thanks for bringing us all together. I guess, if anyone has any closing thoughts or comments, we can maybe open it up. I think we've gone through all the questions, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And if anyone is wondering, we will have a recording of the session available on the blog where the sign-up form was. So we will be posting this over the next week or two. Our next session, Andrew, do you want to just intro our next topic and dates? Absolutely. So coming up on June 25th, we're going to be running our next iComply event. We'll be looking at digital securities. And we'll have probably a new link for this one. We might be considering using a different platform for the next week. So stay in touch with me via email. I will be sending out more information as it becomes available.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. Goodbye, guys.
And thank you for the great questions from our audience. I appreciate all of your time, and I look forward to hearing from you guys again soon.